The most feared man in the city walked into a courtroom expecting to bury his wife quietly. He brought champagne. He brought his mistress. He brought every lawyer money could corrupt. Victor Moretti had spent 20 years building an empire on the belief that he controlled everything: politicians, judges, the underground veins of an entire city. He had forgotten one thing. The woman sitting across the aisle had spent those same 20 years building something he never saw coming. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was waiting. And waiting, for Elena Voss, was a weapon sharper than anything Victor had ever carried. If this story already has your attention, hit that like button right now, drop the name of your city in the comments, and let me see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about power. The morning of the divorce hearing, Elena Voss woke before her alarm. She lay still for a full minute, staring at the ceiling of the hotel suite she'd rented 3 weeks ago, when she finally stopped pretending the apartment in Victor's building felt like home. The room smelled of fresh linen and someone else's furniture polish. Not hers. Not comfortable. But it was safe. And safe was the only luxury she'd been chasing for the last 4 years. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't run through the sequence of events she'd rehearsed with Adriana until 2 in the morning. She just breathed. In through the nose, slow, until her ribs expanded fully. Out through the mouth, slower. The way the therapist she'd seen exactly twice had shown her before she decided she didn't have time to sit in a soft chair and talk about feelings when there was a war to survive. Noah was asleep in the adjoining room. She could hear the faint rhythm of his breathing through the cracked door. He was 17, too old to be shielded from the truth, not old enough to carry it without it leaving marks. She'd spent the last 2 months measuring how much to tell him, weighing every word like it was evidence she might have to defend later. He knew more than she wanted, less than he suspected. She got up quietly, moved to the bathroom, and stood under the shower until the water turned lukewarm. She didn't think about Victor. She didn't think about Isabella Romano's face on those photographs, the ones Adriana had filed into the evidentiary record with the same methodical calm she applied to everything. Elena had spent enough hours thinking about that. The anger was still there. It wasn't going anywhere, but she'd learned to hold it differently, the way you hold a coal with tongs instead of bare hands. By the time Noah knocked on the bathroom door, she was already dressed. Black. Simple. The kind of thing that said she wasn't performing grief and wasn't performing strength either. Just there. Present. Done. Mom. His voice was rougher than she remembered from a year ago. The boy's voice was almost gone, replaced by something that cracked on the edges when he was tired or scared. He was both right now, she could tell without looking. You okay? I'm fine. She opened the door and looked at him, his father's dark eyes, her father's jaw, a combination that had always made her chest do something complicated. Did you sleep? Some. He shrugged the way teenagers do when they mean no. Adriana texted. She's already at the courthouse. I know. I'll call her in the car. She moved past him toward the kitchenette, started the small coffee maker. You don't have to come, Noah. I've said that. Your grandfather offered. I'm coming. No room in it, the same tone Victor used when a subject was closed. Except on Victor's mouth, it always felt like a door slamming. On Noah's, it just felt like a decision made. He's my father. I want to be there. She didn't argue. She'd stopped arguing with him about that 6 months ago when she realized she was asking him to pretend the situation was smaller than it was, and that was its own kind of damage. She poured 2 cups. They drank them standing at the counter in silence, which was somehow the most honest conversation they'd had in weeks. The courthouse was a gray stone building on Rennick Avenue that had survived 3 administrations, 1 significant flood, and the particular kind of civic indifference that makes public buildings feel like they've given up. Elena had been inside it twice before, once for a property dispute involving one of their early development contracts, 8 years ago, when she and Victor had still been something that resembled a partnership. Once when Noah had been caught shoplifting at 15, a pack of cigarettes, a moment of stupid teenage rebellion, the kind Victor had called an embarrassment, and Elena had quietly handled by driving Noah home herself and sitting with him in the car for 2 hours until he cried, and told her he didn't know why he'd done it. She knew why. But that was a conversation for a different kind of day. Adriana Vale was waiting on the courthouse steps. She was 41, small in a way that made people underestimate her until she opened her mouth, wearing a charcoal suit that had the cut of something expensive, the bearing of someone who didn't need anyone to notice it was expensive. She had a leather case under one arm and her phone in her hand, and she was texting without looking at the screen, which Elena had learned was a normal state for her. "He's already inside," Adriana said it without preamble, sliding the phone into her jacket pocket. "Arrived 30 minutes ago. His team is significant. Harlan Green brought 2 associates and a paralegal I don't recognize, which means they pulled someone in last minute. Could be a document issue, could be theatrical." She looked at Elena directly. "Could be they know about the Carver testimony and they're trying to find a counter." "Let them look," Elena said. "They won't find one." Adriana's expression didn't change much. A fraction of something. Satisfaction, maybe, or the professional equivalent of it. "How's Noah?" "Here," Noah said it flatly from behind Elena's shoulder. He'd hung back on the steps, hands in the pockets of the dark jacket she'd made him wear. He looked at Adriana with the particular teenage assessment that meant he was deciding whether to trust her. He'd been doing it since the first meeting, slow and careful. "Is my dad going to look at me in there?" Adriana considered the question the way she considered everything, without flinching. "Probably. If he does, you don't have to react. You don't have to do anything. You're there as a, I know why I'm there." He said it without heat, just tired. "Let's go." Oh. The main corridor of the courthouse smelled like floor wax and recycled air. Elena walked it with her back straight and her hands loose at her sides, not clasped together the way she would have done 4 years ago, when she'd still been managing the private performance of a woman who had everything under control. She didn't need to perform that anymore. The control was real now, or real enough. She saw Victor before he saw her. He was standing near the double doors of Courtroom C, speaking quietly to Harlan Green, his head slightly lowered in the way he did when he was issuing instructions he expected to be followed exactly. He was wearing a black suit that had been made for him specifically. She recognized the cut from the same tailor he'd used for 7 years. A man named Castelli, who worked out of a shop on Mercer Street, and who had, Elena knew, been paid in cash twice a year for as long as she could remember. The suit said money. It said permanence. It said, "I have been here before, and I will be here after." Isabella Romano was beside him. Younger by 14 years, dark-haired, wearing something pale and careful. She was looking at Victor the way people look at things they're not entirely sure are real. Elena had spent 3 months trying to feel the right things about Isabella, and had eventually concluded that what she felt was nothing particularly useful. Isabella wasn't the problem. Isabella was a symptom. Victor turned when the corridor shifted. Some animal awareness, the particular alertness of a man who had survived enough ambushes to feel them before they arrived. He looked at Elena. She met his gaze and held it. 23 years of marriage. She knew that face in every condition, laughing in the early years when they'd had nothing, and it hadn't mattered. Hard and silent in the middle years when the empire began to pull him somewhere she couldn't follow. And now. Now it was the face of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at the wrong answer, and who didn't know it yet. She didn't stop walking. He watched her pass. She felt it, the weight of it, the way his attention had always carried mass, and didn't let it slow her down. Noah was half a step behind her on her left. He didn't look at his father. Victor's eyes moved to him and stayed there for a long moment, and Elena didn't watch that either. There were things she could hold and things she couldn't, and watching Victor look at their son with whatever was happening behind those eyes was one she'd learned to set down. Courtroom C was standard, wood paneling that had darkened over decades to the color of old tea, fluorescent overheads that gave everything a slight pallor, rows of public gallery benches, most of them empty. This was a civil proceeding, not a criminal spectacle, and whatever Victor had expected in terms of an audience had been limited by Adriana's motion to restrict gallery access. There were still a dozen people. Journalists Elena recognized from the business pages. 2 men near the back she didn't recognize and didn't like the look of. Not Victor's lawyers, too casual, too attentive. She'd mentioned them to Adriana. They took their seats at the left table. Victor's team arranged themselves on the right. Harlan Green, 62, silver-haired, the kind of attorney who had been expensive for so long that people had stopped questioning whether he was worth it, settled into his chair with the deliberate ease of someone who considered courtrooms his natural habitat. He did not look at Elena's table. One of his associates did, a young woman with a short dark ponytail who glanced over with the particular expression of someone taking inventory. Elena didn't blink. Judge Marianne Cross entered at 9:14. 60, black, with the posture of someone who had decided a long time ago that courtrooms were workplaces and should be treated accordingly. She had a reputation, Adriana had briefed Elena on it in detail, for impatience with theater and precision with law. She did not suffer performance. She had, in 17 years on the family court bench, handled 11 cases involving figures connected to organized crime and had ruled against political preference in 9 of them. She was, Adriana had said, the best judge they could have drawn. They rose. They sat. The court clerk read the case number. Victor Harlan Moretti versus Elena Voss Moretti. Dissolution of marriage, contested. Property division and custody of minor child, Noah Voss Moretti, age 17. Elena breathed. Harlan Green stood first. He had the voice of someone who had trained it, low, carrying, the kind of voice that made juries and judges feel they were being confided in. He called Victor a self-made man. He said the word visionary without any apparent embarrassment. He talked about the Moretti portfolio as if Victor had conjured it from pure will, the legitimate holdings of a man who had built something from nothing through decades of sacrifice and risk. My client acknowledges that his wife was present during the formative years of his business career, Green said, and the word present hung in the air of the courtroom like something slightly rotten. And he wishes to compensate her generously for that presence. He is offering a settlement of $12 million, the property on Caldwell Lake, and continued health care coverage for compensate her for her presence, Adriana said. She hadn't stood. She'd said it from her seat, at a volume that was perfectly audible and conversational, and the judge looked at her with an expression that was not a smile but contained one. Ms. Vale, Judge Cross said it mildly. My apologies, Your Honor. Adriana stood. Her voice shifted into something cleaner. We accept Mr. Green's characterization of Mrs. Voss Moretti's role as a jumping-off point. However, the characterization is incomplete. We intend to demonstrate today that Elena Voss did not merely witness the building of Moretti Voss Holdings. She built it. Green's expression didn't change. Victor's did. A slight tightening around the jaw, something that in the old days Elena would have read as the beginning of patience running out. She watched it from across the room and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Not pleasure, not victory. Something older and colder and more tired than either of those. The first hour was procedural. Documents entered into the record, motions addressed, timelines established. Elena sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her and listened to the architecture of her own life being described in legal language. Dates, asset values, transfer records. The numbers were enormous and felt completely abstract, and she let them be abstract because she'd already had all the emotional reactions to all of these numbers in private, in hotel rooms, and in Adriana's conference room, and once in a parking garage on the 3rd level where she'd sat in her car for 40 minutes with her head against the steering wheel. She'd given herself that. The private falling apart, the controlled disintegration in places where no one was watching. Because here, in this room, she needed to be the version of herself that had been built from everything Victor hadn't seen, the version that had been prepared. Noah sat beside her with his jaw set and his eyes forward. She didn't look at him too often. She didn't want him to feel monitored, but twice she felt his knee press against hers under the table, not leaning, just contact, just present, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as it lasted. Adriana began the evidentiary presentation at 10:40. She was methodical in the way that good lawyers are methodical. Not showy, not building to drama artificially, just laying each piece down with the patience of someone who knew the shape of what they were constructing and didn't need to announce it. She started with the incorporation documents for Moretti Voss Holdings, filed 22 years ago. Elena Voss listed as co-founder and equity partner, equal shares. Green objected. Standard, Overruled. She presented the initial capital investment records. Elena's family inheritance, $460,000, transferred from the Voss Estate Trust following her mother's death, the majority of the seed capital that had funded their first property acquisition. Green objected again. Something about relevance to current valuation. The judge heard it, considered it for approximately 4 seconds, and overruled it. The first witness was a man named Douglas Trent, who had been the project manager on their second development, a converted warehouse on the south waterfront that had become, over a decade, one of the most sought-after commercial addresses in the city. He was 60 now, a little overweight, with the careful bearing of someone who had thought hard about what he was willing to say and had decided to say all of it. He described Elena Voss in the way people describe someone who made a significant difference in their working life, specifically, without flattery, from memory. She had designed the interior conversion concept. She had managed the contractor relationships. She had been the one present on site when Victor wasn't available, which was most of the time in those years because Victor was managing the other side of the operation, the side that didn't appear in any filing. She knew the business, Trent said. I mean, she knew it. She could read a contract faster than most people who'd been doing it twice as long. And she understood what people wanted, not just in terms of space, but in terms of feeling. That's why those properties worked, not because of the money behind them, because someone actually thought about them. Green cross-examined him for 20 minutes, probing at dates and specifics, looking for the crack in the testimony that wasn't there. Trent answered each question with the flat patience of a man who had been telling the truth for so long he'd forgotten how to be rattled by attempts to complicate it. Victor watched from across the room with an expression Elena recognized from board meetings, the one where he was tracking something and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. The second witness was a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been the accounting director for Moretti Voss Holdings for 11 years before leaving to start her own firm. She was precise, technical, and the least comfortable-looking person in the room, which Elena recognized as a specific kind of courage. Patricia Osei had not wanted to testify. She had agreed because Elena had asked her directly, in person, and because Elena had spent 3 years building the kind of relationship that meant Patricia felt she owed it to the truth rather than to either party in the room. She walked through the financial architecture of the company in the early years, how the investment decisions had been made, whose signature was on which authorization, how the legitimate revenue had been structured to present a clean face to auditors and investors. Who made those structural decisions? Adriana asked. In the early period, primarily Mrs. Voss Moretti, Patricia said. She did not look at Victor. She had a system for categorizing incoming and outgoing funds that protected the legitimate operations from any contamination from other revenue sources. A pause. She was protecting the company from exposure. She understood the risk, and she built a wall around the clean assets. She protected the legitimate empire, Adriana said. Not a question. Yes, Patricia's voice was even. She did. The room was quiet for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with silence. Elena kept her eyes on the middle distance. She could feel Victor's attention on her like pressure against the side of her face. She didn't turn. She'd spent enough years turning toward that attention when it meant something. Now it meant something different, and she was finished with it. The ownership transfer document came in at the 11:40 mark, 20 minutes before the lunch recess. Adriana presented it with the same flat precision she'd brought to everything else, but Elena had been present for enough preparation sessions to recognize the particular quality of stillness in her attorney when she was handling something she considered a finisher. It was a 12-page document executed 9 years ago. At the time, Victor had been facing a civil lawsuit from a former business partner who had, in Victor's assessment, become a problem that needed legal rather than other resolution. The suit had threatened the Moretti Voss Holdings portfolio. Victor's attorneys at the time, a different firm, older, 2 of whom had since retired under circumstances that didn't bear scrutiny, had advised him to move the legitimate assets out of his direct name as a protective measure. Elena's name was already on the company. The transfer was simple. What Victor had apparently not read with sufficient attention was the clause governing the reversal of the transfer. The assets would remain in Elena's name, and could only be transferred back to joint or individual control upon the mutual signed agreement of both parties. Both parties. Mr. Moretti signed this document on March 14th, 9 years ago, Adriana said, presenting the certified copy. Mrs. Voss Moretti signed it the same day. The transfer was completed within the month, and according to the corporate records, which we have submitted in their entirety as Exhibit 14, the reversal transfer was never executed. Green was on his feet before Adriana finished the sentence. Your Honor, this document has no bearing on the current— It has every bearing, Adriana said, not raising her voice. But because it means that for the past 9 years, the majority of what is described as Mr. Moretti's legitimate business empire has been, in legal terms, my client's. The room made a sound, not loud, more like a pressure shift. Elena did not allow herself to look at Victor. She looked at the judge. Judge Cross was reading the document her clerk had just placed in front of her, her reading glasses on, her expression entirely neutral in the specific way of someone who is processing something significant. Green was arguing. The words came out fast and well-constructed. She'd known they would be. Harlan Green had not gotten where he was by being slow. And the argument was essentially that the transfer had been executed under duress, under specific circumstances, with no intent for it to be permanent. Intent, Adriana said when the judge gave her the floor, is not the operative legal standard here. The document is clear. The clause is unambiguous, and I have one further item. She produced another document, submitted it. This is a certified letter sent by Elena Voss Moretti to Victor Moretti by registered mail, confirmed received 7 years ago. In it, my client explicitly states that the ownership structure as it exists represents the financial foundation of their son's future and that she considers it a permanent arrangement unless both parties agree otherwise. Adriana let the silence hold for exactly the right number of seconds. Mr. Moretti signed the confirmation of receipt. He never responded to the letter. Noah's knee pressed against Elena's under the table. She breathed. Bad. The lunch recess was 45 minutes. Elena took Noah to a small cafe 2 blocks from the courthouse and ordered soup neither of them particularly wanted and sat across from him in a booth by the window while the city moved past outside like it had no idea what was happening 2 blocks away. He knew, Noah said. He was looking at his soup. About the document. He had to know. He knew. Elena was careful with her voice. Not flat, not performing steadiness she didn't feel, just honest. He thought it didn't matter. He thought— She stopped, started again. He thought I would never use it, because I never had before. Noah was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you? Before. Use it. The question was simple, and she'd been expecting it for months. She had answers that were true and answers that were easy, and she picked the one that was both. Because for a long time I was still trying to make it work. The marriage, the family, you. I was trying to hold everything together because I believed that was what I was supposed to do. She looked at him. And then I stopped believing that. He looked up from the soup. When? When he tried to take you. Her voice didn't change. When I found out about the custody arrangement he'd been discussing with his lawyers before he'd even told me he wanted a divorce. When I realized he'd decided Noah Moretti belonged to his empire and Elena Voss could accept a check and disappear. She held her son's gaze. That was when. Noah looked at her for a long moment with his father's dark eyes in her father's face and something that was neither of those things. Something that was just him, specific and particular and his own. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay. She didn't know exactly what it covered. She thought it might cover everything. The afternoon session began at 1:15. Green had regrouped. He presented his counter-argument on the ownership document with the kind of structured legal precision that cost $400 an hour and was worth it. The argument was not without merit, technically. He raised questions about the original intent of the transfer, about subsequent conduct that could be construed as treating the assets as jointly held, about the impracticality of the clause as written. The judge listened to it with the attention of someone who was already forming responses. Then Adriana stood for the custody portion. Elena had known this was coming. She had sat in Adriana's office for 6 weeks building this section of the case, going over every document, every testimony, every record. She had done it with the clinical focus of someone who had made peace with the fact that in order to protect her son, she was going to have to lay out his father's life in a courtroom with the lights on. She had not enjoyed that peace, but she had made it. The picture Adriana painted was not a fairy tale of corruption. It was more damaging than that. It was specific. School records showing Noah's attendance disruptions during periods when Victor's operations required sudden relocations. Medical records from a year ago when Noah had presented with stress-related symptoms that the physician had noted carefully might be connected to environmental instability. Testimony from Noah's school counselor, who described a boy who was intelligent and perceptive and carrying something too heavy for someone his age. There was also the security detail. The men Victor had assigned to Noah without consulting Elena. The tracking application on Noah's phone that Noah himself had found and removed 6 months ago, and that Elena had then documented. The phone call recordings, legally obtained, Adriana had been very specific about this, in which Victor discussed Noah's future in terms that treated him as a succession matter rather than a person. Victor's lawyer argued that all of this represented engaged fatherhood, a desire to protect, standard security for the family of a high-profile businessman. The judge's face during this portion of the proceedings had a quality that Elena recognized from certain conversations she'd had over the years. The expression of someone who was listening carefully to an argument they found fundamentally unpersuasive and were waiting politely for it to finish. By 3 o'clock, Elena's back was aching from the chair, and her throat was dry from not drinking enough water, and she was operating on 4 hours of sleep, and the particular stripped-down clarity that comes when you have been afraid for a long time, and the thing you were afraid of is finally happening, and it turns out you can survive it. Victor had not spoken. He'd communicated everything through Green, through posture, through the occasional whispered consultation. But twice during the afternoon session, Elena had felt him looking at her in a way that was different from the controlled assessment of the morning. Something had shifted in it, something she didn't have a name for yet. She didn't spend time trying to find one. At 3:40, Judge Cross called a brief recess to review the final submissions. The clerk distributed the summary documents. The public gallery, which had remained largely quiet, shifted and murmured. Elena stood and stretched her back discreetly and turned to speak quietly to Adriana, and that was when she saw it. Victor was standing. He had moved away from his table, past Green's restraining hand, and he was crossing the floor of the courtroom, not toward the judge, not toward the exit, toward her. The 2 men she hadn't recognized earlier, the ones in the gallery, had come forward. They were stopped immediately by the court officer, but the disruption rippled through the room, and the judge's clerk looked up sharply, and Green was saying something fast and urgent under his breath, and Noah, beside Elena, had gone very still. Victor stopped 6 feet from her. He looked at her the way he hadn't in years, directly, without the mediation of lawyers or plans or the protective glass of control. He was 53 years old, and his face showed it in ways his tailor's suit couldn't counteract. And Elena thought in that moment that whatever else he was also a man who had believed completely in a version of the world that was disappearing. Elena. His voice was low, private, wrong for the setting in every way. Mr. Moretti? Adriana stepped forward, one hand raised. You planned this. He wasn't looking at Adriana. He was looking at Elena, and there was something in it that wasn't anger. Anger she'd seen from him 1,000 times. She could read anger the way you read weather. This was something he didn't usually show, something beneath the anger. The letter, the documents. You planned this years ago. Elena looked at him. She let herself see him clearly. The man she'd married, the man she'd built something with, the man who had decided somewhere along the way that what he'd built was more his because he was the one willing to be brutal about it. Yes, she said. I did. His jaw tightened. We could have handled this differently. You had every opportunity. Her voice was even. Not cold, just finished. You chose not to. The court officer had reached them. Victor looked at Elena for one more moment, a long one, the kind that had to hold everything that wasn't going to be said, and then turned and walked back to his table, and Green put a hand on his shoulder and Victor sat down. Noah exhaled slowly beside her. She hadn't realized he'd been holding it. Judge Cross returned at 4:10. She had the deliberate pace of someone whose time was their own and who did not perform urgency for audiences. She settled, reviewed her notes once, looked up. She ruled on the property matter first. The ownership transfer document, she said, was legally unambiguous. The clause governing reversal required mutual consent, which had not been obtained. The subsequent letter from Elena Voss Moretti established that she was aware of and asserted this arrangement. Mr. Moretti's failure to respond or contest it in the 9 years since constituted acceptance of the arrangement as standing. She ruled in favor of Elena on the matter of the Moretti-Voss Holdings portfolio. Victor's legitimate empire, the buildings, the holdings, the public face of everything he had spent 20 years constructing, belonged, as a matter of law, to Elena Voss. Green was already filing a motion. She acknowledged it, set a date for it to be heard. Moved on. For custody, she said the standard was the best interest of the child. She had reviewed all submitted materials. She noted that Noah was 17 and that his own expressed preference, submitted in a separate affidavit that Adriana had filed 3 weeks earlier, carried significant weight. Elena had not read that affidavit. She had told Noah she wouldn't. She had meant it. Judge Cross awarded primary physical and legal custody of Noah Voss Moretti to Elena Voss Moretti. Supervised visitation rights for Victor Moretti to be reviewed at 12 months. The room held the ruling for a moment the way a body holds impact before it registers pain. Then the sound started. The gallery, the shuffling of papers. Green's controlled voice beginning the process of managing what had just happened. And Elena heard from somewhere behind her and to the right a sound she didn't immediately identify. She turned. The champagne bottle. Victor had brought it. She'd known he had. Adriana had mentioned it with something that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite pity. And it had been on the floor beside his chair, and now it was not. The sound had been it hitting the tile. The cork had blown sometime in the fall, and the pale liquid was spreading in a slow arc across the courtroom floor. And Victor Moretti was standing behind his table with both hands pressed flat on the surface, his head slightly bowed, and the champagne he had brought to celebrate his wife's defeat was bleeding out across the floor around his feet. Noah's hand found Elena's. She held it. She did not feel triumph. She felt tired and clean, and something that might eventually become peace once she'd slept and eaten and been in a room where no one was watching. The judge called for order. The clerk began gathering documents. And Victor Moretti stood at the center of his own collapse with his hands flat on the table and his empire already somewhere else, belonging to someone he had believed he would always be able to control. Elena did not look at him again. She looked at her son, who was holding her hand and looking back at her with his father's eyes and his own face, and she thought, "This is what I was protecting. This is what it was for." But as she moved toward the door with Noah's hand in hers, and Adriana already talking logistics in her ear, she became aware of something she hadn't anticipated. The two men from the gallery, the ones she hadn't recognized, the ones who had been stopped at the rail, were gone. They had not come in with Victor's legal team. They had not been identified. They had arrived before the proceedings began, and they had left before the ruling finished, and they had watched the entire morning and afternoon with the careful attention of men receiving information rather than men observing a proceeding. She told herself it was nothing. Men came to courtrooms for all kinds of reasons. But the thought stayed with her all the way down the courthouse corridor, through the brass doors and out into the gray October afternoon. The feeling that something had just started that she had not planned for, and that Victor's loss today was not the same thing as his acceptance of it. And as the courthouse doors closed behind them, and the city opened up around her and Noah and the reporters began calling questions, and the afternoon light fell flat and cold across the stone steps, Elena Voss felt the back of her neck prickle with the particular awareness of a woman who had survived 20 years beside a dangerous man, and had learned, above all else, to trust that feeling. She pulled Noah closer. She kept walking. The reporters found them on the third step. There were 6 of them, which was fewer than Elena had expected and more than she wanted. And they moved the way reporters move when they've been waiting outside in the cold for 4 hours, and have decided that patience should be rewarded with proximity. Questions came in overlapping waves about the ruling, about the empire, about Victor, about Noah, and Elena walked through it with her hand on Noah's arm and her eyes forward and her mouth closed, the way Adriana had coached her, which was the same way she'd learned to walk through rooms full of Victor's associates who were assessing whether she was a weakness. She was not a weakness. She had proven that today in a courtroom with fluorescent lights and floor wax and a judge who didn't suffer performance. But the proving was over for today, and she was running on empty, and her son was rigid under her hand in the way that meant he was holding himself together through effort rather than ease. Adriana ran interference with the economy of someone who had done it before. A raised hand, a firm, "My client has no comment at this time." A body positioned between Elena and the nearest microphone. They made it to the car. Black sedan, hired, waiting at the curb with the engine running. Elena got in first, Noah second. Adriana leaned in the window for 30 seconds to say something about tomorrow's follow-up, and the motion Green had already filed, and then the car moved. Noah sat back against the seat. He closed his eyes. Elena watched the courthouse fall away through the rear window. Victor's car, the black Escalade he'd used for 12 years, the one with the reinforced panels she'd never been supposed to know about, was still at the curb. She could see two of his men near it, talking. Victor himself wasn't visible. She turned back around and faced forward and let out a breath she'd been holding in one form or another since 9 in the morning. "You okay?" she said. "Ask me in about 3 days." Noah didn't open his eyes. She almost smiled. "Fair." They rode the rest of the way to the hotel in silence, which was the right decision. But the call from Victor came at 7:43 that evening. Elena was sitting at the small desk in the hotel suite with a plate of room service pasta going cold beside her and a stack of documents Adriana had sent over regarding Green's motion, which was, as predicted, arguing that the ownership transfer should be declared void on grounds of constructive fraud. She'd been through it twice and was beginning a third pass when the phone rang. She looked at the screen. His name was still in her contacts because she'd never seen a reason to remove it, and because removing it would have felt like something she didn't want to perform even for herself. She let it ring 4 times, then she answered. "Victor." A pause. She could hear background noise, tool, a room, other people somewhere behind him, the particular ambient quality of his office in the building on Callaway Street that she'd been in maybe 100 times and would never enter again. "I want to talk." His voice was flat, controlled. The anger was in it somewhere, but pressed down, the way he pressed things down when he was operating rather than reacting. "Your lawyers can call Adriana." "Not about that." Another pause. "About Noah." She set down the document she was holding. "There's a visitation schedule in the order. Adriana can—" "Elena." Just her name. The way he'd said it at the beginning, years ago, when it had meant something she'd believed in. Now it was a tool, and she was done being moved by the tools he used. "I'm not calling about schedules. I'm calling because you are not going to win this." She felt something shift in the room's temperature. Or maybe that was just her, the particular chill of someone who has heard a statement that isn't quite a threat, but is the architecture of one. The judge ruled today. Flat. Certain. "You know how this works. You've been married to me for 23 years. You know what I have, and you know what I can move, and you know that a civil ruling is not the end of anything. It's the beginning of a different conversation." She breathed, slow. "Are you threatening me on a recorded line?" A beat. "I'm telling you what's true." His voice shifted, not softer, exactly, but different. The register he used when he was trying to reach something real under all the positioning. She'd heard it rarely enough that she still noticed it. "This didn't have to be this way." "No," she said. "It didn't. You made a series of choices, Victor, over a long time. This is the consequence. You made choices too." "I made different choices." She picked up the document again. "I have to go." "Elena?" She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone face down on the desk. Her hand was not shaking. She noted this without pride because the not shaking had taken her 3 years to build, and it wasn't something she was sentimental about. It was just a result. Then she got up and went to Noah's door and knocked twice. "He called," she said when he opened it. He was in a t-shirt and track pants, half watching something on his laptop that he'd paused. "I wanted you to know." Noah looked at her. "What did he say?" "That this isn't over." A silence. Noah leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his jaw doing the thing it did when he was deciding whether to say the next thing. "Is he right?" "Probably." She was honest about it because she owed him that. "But we knew he would be. Adriana knew. We planned for it." "How far does he go?" His voice was careful. "Like, how far?" She looked at her son and thought about all the things she knew about Victor Moretti that had never been in a courtroom file and never would be, and she thought about the two men in the gallery who had left before the ruling and whose names she still didn't have. "I don't know," she said, "but I will be between you and it, whatever it is." Noah was quiet for a moment, then he nodded, not reassured exactly, just acknowledging, just present. "Okay," he said, which was the same thing he'd said in the cafe. Maybe it covered everything again. She went back to the documents. Adriana arrived at 8 the next morning with 2 coffees and the expression of someone who had been awake since 5. "Green filed 3 additional motions overnight," she said, settling at the table and pulling out her tablet. "The fraud argument on the ownership transfer, which we expected. A motion to recuse Judge Cross on grounds of alleged prior bias, which is a Hail Mary and they know it. And..." She paused, scrolling. "A petition to have Noah's custody affidavit unsealed and introduced into a separate proceeding." Elena looked up. "What separate proceeding?" "That's the question." Adriana set the tablet down. "There's nothing filed yet, but the language suggests they're building towards something, possibly a challenge to your fitness as a custodial parent." The room was quiet for a moment. "On what grounds?" Elena said. "I don't know yet. I'm working on it." Adriana's voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't, and Elena had spent enough time with her to read the gap. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it completely." "Ask." "Is there anything Victor could bring up about your conduct, not your business conduct, your personal conduct, that I don't already know about?" She met Elena's eyes directly. "Anything that could be characterized as instability, negligence, behavior that would reflect negatively on your capacity as a parent." Elena held the question for a moment. The honest version of the answer was complicated. There had been 2 years in the middle of the marriage that she was not proud of, a period when the gap between who she was and who she was pretending to be had gotten wide enough that she'd made choices she wouldn't make now. Nothing criminal, nothing that had touched Noah, but things that could be shaped if someone skilled was doing the shaping. She told Adriana. All of it. The way she'd told her nothing before, carefully, in pieces, measuring what was necessary. Adriana listened without interrupting. When Elena was finished, her attorney sat back in her chair and looked at the middle distance for a moment with the expression of someone adjusting calculations. "That's manageable," she said finally. "None of it is what they'd hoped for, but it tells me they're going to dig, which means I need to be ahead of the digging." She looked at Elena. "Is there anything else? Anything at all?" "No." "Okay." Adriana picked up her coffee. "There's something else. One of my contacts, a woman I trust who works in the municipal permitting office. She called me this morning. She said there were 2 men asking questions about you yesterday afternoon, after the ruling. The chill again, the same temperature shift as last night. Questions about what? Your properties, your address history, current residence." Adriana's voice was careful. "Not the kind of questions investigators ask. The kind of questions someone asks when they want to know where a person is." Elena set her coffee down. "Where's Noah?" Adriana said. "Asleep. He should stay here today. Don't tell him why yet." She was already typing. "I'm calling someone I know in private security. This is probably Victor applying pressure, making you feel watched, making you feel like the space is closing. He's done it before, but I want to be careful." "Yes," Elena said. "So do I." The call Elena didn't expect came at 11:15, while Noah was still asleep and Adriana was in a corner of the suite on her phone, arguing quietly with someone about the recusal motion. The number was one she didn't recognize. A local area code, but no name. She answered it because she'd promised herself she wouldn't hide in the hotel room flinching at unfamiliar numbers. Mrs. Voss Moretti. A woman's voice, controlled, mid-range, with the particular diction of someone educated in a different country. My name is Petra Vance. I represent certain interests that have been watching the Moretti situation with some attention. Elena stood up from the desk. I don't know who you are. I know. That's fine. I'm calling because what happened in court yesterday created a development that affects people beyond you and Mr. Moretti, and I thought you deserved to understand that before decisions are made that you don't know are being made. The hair on Elena's arms. What kind of decisions? Victor Moretti's legitimate holdings are now legally yours. Petra Vance said it without inflection, like a financial report. That means the relationships attached to those holdings, the contracts, the arrangements, the ongoing obligations, are now yours too, whether you want them or not. A pause. Some of the people holding those arrangements are not patient men. They are going to want to know very quickly who they are dealing with and what the new arrangement looks like. Elena's jaw was tight. I don't know what arrangements you're referring to. Yes, you do. The voice was not unkind. It was simply sure. You built that company, Mrs. Voss Moretti. You know what its legitimate face was sitting in front of. You may have spent years choosing not to look directly at it, but you know. She did. She had always known, the way you know about a room in your own house that you've decided not to go into. The shape of it was clear from the edges, the payments that moved in patterns too regular and too large to be purely commercial, the meetings Victor had in places you don't hold business meetings, the men she recognized from news reports and chose not to recognize out loud. I don't intend to have any part of that, Elena said. I understand, but intending and achieving are different things when the people involved have their own intentions. Another pause. I'm calling you as a courtesy, someone who thought you should not be surprised. What you do with it is yours. Who are you working for? I'm not able to say, but I will tell you this, not everyone with an interest in Victor Moretti's business wants to see it collapse. Some people would prefer an orderly transition, a cooperative one. The voice was very even. Think about it, that's all. The call ended. Elena stood with the phone in her hand in the middle of the hotel room, with the mid-morning light coming through the half-drawn curtains and the sound of Adriana still talking in the corner, and somewhere behind the closed door her son sleeping. She turned to Adriana. I need to tell you something. Adriana heard it the way she heard everything, without visible reaction, asking precise questions, writing notes on a yellow legal pad in the compressed handwriting Elena had come to read as a sign that she was moving fast internally. When Elena finished, Adriana put the pen down. She called you directly, she said. Not a question. Yes. Which means she has your number. Yes. And she knew enough about the ruling to frame it in terms of contractual liability, which means she's connected to people who track these proceedings closely. Adriana stared at her notes. Petra Vance. I'll run it, but the name is probably not the one she uses for anything important. Is she right? Elena said. About the obligations. Adriana's mouth pressed together. It was a moment Elena recognized. The one where her attorney was choosing between the answer that was easy and the answer that was necessary. Potentially, she said. If the legitimate holdings are genuinely yours now, and I believe they are, and I believe will survive Green's challenge, then there is an argument that the contractual ecosystem around those holdings comes with them, not the criminal operations. Those are Victor's liability, and frankly, his exposure. But the gray areas, the businesses that were legitimate on paper but were used to move other things, those are more complicated. How complicated? Complicated enough that I want to bring in someone else. A colleague who does criminal defense and has more specific experience with RICO adjacency than I do. She said it matter-of-factly. This is still manageable, but I need to be honest with you. What happened in court yesterday was the first move. It was a good move, and it was necessary, and we won it. But Victor is going to respond on multiple fronts simultaneously, And one of those fronts may involve making the legitimate empire too dangerous for you to hold. Elena heard it. Let it settle. He can't take it back through the courts, she said. No. Adriana's voice was quiet. But there are other ways to make a thing uninhabitable. The door to Noah's room opened. He came out in the same track pants and t-shirt, hair uncombed, squinting slightly at the light. He looked at both of them and read the room with the accuracy of a teenager who had grown up in a house where reading rooms was survival. What happened? He said. Not a question. Nothing yet, Elena said. Sit down. He sat. She told him, edited and partial but honest about the shape of it, that Victor was fighting back, that it was going to be more complicated than one court day, that they were handling it. Noah listened with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor and his jaw set. He's not going to let it go, Noah said when she finished. He never lets anything go. He looked up. I know him better than you think I do, Mom. I've been watching him my whole life. Elena held his gaze. Tell me. A long pause. Noah rubbed the back of his neck. 3 months ago, before all this started, before you filed, he had a meeting at the house. I wasn't supposed to be there. I told him I was going to Marcus's and I came back because I forgot something and I heard them in the study. He paused. There were 2 men. I didn't see their faces. I heard one of them say that the transfer papers were a liability and that it should have been resolved years ago. Another pause. And I heard Dad say it was handled, that it would never come up, that you... He stopped. Tell me, Elena said again, and her voice was steady, that you were too loyal to use it against him. Noah's voice was careful with something he was feeling behind it. That he knew you, that whatever you had, you'd never burn it because you still believed in the family. The room was very quiet. Elena thought about Victor in the courtroom yesterday, his hands flat on the table after the ruling, the champagne spreading on the floor. She thought about the 23 years and the house they'd built, and the company she'd built inside it, and the son she'd built everything around. She thought about the exact moment, 4 years ago, in an attorney's office, looking at the custody papers Victor had drafted without telling her, when she had decided that the loyalty Victor was counting on had a different shape than he imagined. Not broken, not betrayal, just finished, the way a season finishes. It was real, and then it ended, and the ending was also real. He was wrong about that, she said. Noah nodded, slow. Yeah. Something moved through his expression, not anger, more like grief without sentimentality. I know. Is there more? Adriana said quietly. From what you heard. Noah looked at her, a decision happening behind his eyes. Then, one of them said your name. He meant Adriana. He said your name and he said they needed to know how you were being funded. Who was backing you? He looked at Elena. Someone's been asking about your legal fees, where the money is coming from, who's behind you. Adriana was very still. Then she reached for her phone. I need to make some calls, she said. Give me an hour. She went to the far corner of the suite. Elena looked at her son. He looked back at her. Outside, the city was making its ordinary noises, traffic and distance, and the particular indifference of a place that had a million things happening at once and didn't know or care that in a hotel room on its west side, the architecture of a family was being examined and rebuilt piece by piece in the aftermath of its demolition. Are you scared? Noah asked. She thought about the true answer, the one that wasn't performance. Yes, she said, but I've been scared for 4 years and I'm still here. She looked at him. So are you. He was quiet for a moment, then, who's Petra Vance? I don't know yet. But she knows things. Yes. Which means she's connected to people who have things to lose. He said it with the particular logic of a 17-year-old who had grown up in proximity to the way power actually worked and had absorbed it without anyone intending for him to. Which means she's not just warning you, she's negotiating. Elena looked at her son. She thought, I have spent his whole life trying to keep this world away from him, and what it gave me was a boy who understands it better than I wanted. She thought, that is both a failure and a miracle, and I don't know yet which one it is more of. And she thought, whatever is coming, He is not wrong about Petra Vance, and the fact that a 17-year-old can see it clearly means that the next move, whatever it is already in motion, and she is already behind it by exactly the amount of time she spent believing that one courtroom victory was enough. Adriana came back from the corner with her phone in her hand and an expression Elena had not seen on her before. Not frightened exactly, but altered, like someone who had just been told something that changed the shape of what they were standing in. "I know who Petra Vance works for," Adriana said. She said the name, and Elena Voss understood for the first time that what she had won in that courtroom yesterday was not a victory. The name Adriana said was Dominic Reyes. Elena knew it. Everyone in the city who had ever moved money at a certain level knew it, the way you know the name of a fault line running under the place you live. Not because you think about it daily, but because it's always been there, and the knowing lives in the background of everything else. Dominic Reyes was not a mafia boss. He was something older and less theatrical than that. He ran a private investment group called Meridian Capital that had no public profile, no website, no press releases, and approximately $11 billion in assets distributed across 4 continents in ways that made Victor Moretti's operation look like a corner store. He had been investigated 3 times by 3 separate federal agencies over the course of 20 years and had never been charged with anything, which was not because he was clean. It was because the people who would have charged him had, at critical moments, decided not to. He was the man Victor borrowed from when Victor needed something he couldn't get himself. Elena knew this because she had seen the wire transfers. Not all of them. Enough. She stood in the middle of the hotel suite and felt the floor reconfigure itself beneath her. "He's been Victor's primary creditor," Adriana said. Her voice was stripped down to essentials. "The legitimate holdings, the ones you now own, were partially collateralized against Reyes's lending 7 years ago, maybe longer." "Collateralized how?" Elena said it flat. "I don't have the full documents yet." Adriana was moving as she talked, pulling her laptop open, pulling papers. "But my contact, the one I just called, he told me that Reyes has been watching this divorce proceeding since before it was filed. He had people in it, probably those men from the gallery." "He was watching to see what would happen to the collateral," Elena said. "Yes." Adriana stopped moving. She looked at Elena directly. "And now that the ruling transferred the holdings to you, you are technically the party holding the collateralized assets, which means that whatever Victor owed Reyes, whatever arrangement they had, Reyes is going to look to you to honor it, or to renegotiate it, or to liquidate it. I'm not party to any arrangement with Dominic Reyes." "You are now." Adriana said it carefully, without apology. "That's what Petra Vance was calling to tell you. Not a warning, a notification. You've inherited a debt you didn't know existed, attached to an empire you just won in court, and the man holding the note is not Victor Moretti." Noah was still on the couch. He had gone very still in the way Elena recognized, the same stillness he'd had at 6 years old when adults were having conversations he wasn't supposed to understand and was understanding completely. He was watching Adriana's face and then her face and processing the geometry of what was being said. "How much?" Elena said. Adriana looked at her notes. "My contact said the number that's been referenced internally is 63 million. The suite was very quiet. $63 million. Against a portfolio Elena now legally held but could not liquidate quickly without triggering a cascade that would destroy its value. Against a legal battle that was still in its first week. Against a son sitting on a couch, 17 years old. She sat down, not because her legs failed, because she needed to think from a different angle, and standing wasn't the right geometry for it. "Victor knew," she said. Not a question. "Almost certainly. He knew that if I won the ruling, I'd inherit this." Adriana was quiet for a moment. "Yes." Elena breathed in slower. She thought about Victor's voice on the phone last night. This isn't over. And the particular certainty in it, the kind of certainty that isn't bravado, that comes from a man who has already set something in motion. She thought about the champagne bottle on the courtroom floor and wondered, for the first time, whether it had been dropped or whether it had been placed. "He let me win," she said. Adriana sat down across from her. I don't know that he let you, but I think he may have calculated that the wind would carry this with it. He loses the holding in court, Elena said, working it out, which means he loses the asset. But if the asset carries a debt obligation to Reyes, if he's been using it as collateral for years, then losing it in court might actually free him from that debt. It moves to me, with the asset. That's the theory. Adriana's voice was careful. I want to be clear that I don't have the documents yet. I don't know the exact terms, but structurally, yes, that's the shape of what my contact described. Noah stood up from the couch. He moved to the window and stood there with his back to the room, looking at the city. His shoulders were up near his ears. He used the divorce, Noah said. His voice was quiet and precise and furious. He was going to lose it anyway. The custody, the legitimacy, the reputation. So he designed it. He designed it so that whatever he lost, you'd be standing in the hole when the ground gave way. He turned around. His face was his father's face, doing something Elena had never seen his father's face do. Something unmediated, raw, the specific devastation of a person discovering that someone they shared blood with was capable of something they hadn't believed possible. He planned this, Noah said, before the court, before the filing. He planned that if he lost, you'd lose worse. Elena looked at her son. She did not lie to him. That's what it looks like, she said. Noah made a sound that wasn't a word. He turned back to the window. Adriana left at noon to get the documents. She had a contact at a financial forensics firm she'd used before who could move fast, and she had a colleague in criminal defense whose name was Martin Shore, and who, she said, had specific experience with Reyes-adjacent situations. She did not explain what that meant in detail, and Elena did not ask. After she left, Elena ordered food. Neither of them ate much. Noah sat at the table and drank a glass of water and pulled out his phone and then put it back without looking at it and then pulled it out again. Don't contact him, Elena said. I wasn't. He put the phone down. I was looking at something else. He paused. There's a property. One of the ones in your portfolio now. The Carver building on the east waterfront. I pulled up the records last night. The development history. He looked at her. Do you know what the ground floor lease arrangement is on that building? Commercial, mixed use. The tenants in the lower 3 floors. He slid the phone across the table. I pulled the corporate registrations. 6 of the 11 entities listed as tenants are shell companies. No employees, no public presence, registered addresses that are mail forwarding services. He held her gaze. 2 of them trace back to a holding group called Meridian. Elena looked at the screen. Meridian Capital, Reyes, in the building she now owned, paying rent, if they were paying rent, to accounts that would now be her accounts. He's been inside it for years, she said. More than that. Noah took the phone back. If those are Reyes's entities in your building, in the building you own, then Reyes isn't just Victor's creditor. He's your tenant. He has a presence inside the legitimate empire. And now you're the landlord. He put the phone down, which means the relationship isn't just financial, it's operational. 17 years old. She thought again. Failure and miracle. How long have you been looking at this? She said. He shrugged. Not evasion, discomfort. Since I heard that meeting 3 months ago, the one I told you about, after I heard them talking about the transfer papers, He stopped. I wanted to understand what I was in the middle of. So I started looking, and you didn't tell me. I didn't want to. He stopped again, rubbed his jaw. I didn't want to add to what you were already carrying. She looked at her son and felt something that had no clean name. Not anger. The protectiveness was real, whatever had motivated it. Not comfort, because what he'd found was burning a hole in the table between them. Something in the range of sorrowful respect, maybe. The specific emotion of a parent watching a child become something serious before they were supposed to have to. Don't do that again, she said quietly. If you find something, if you know something, you tell me. We are not in a position where carrying things alone helps anyone. He held her gaze. Okay, she said. And then, You did good work. He looked away, nodded once. A muscle in his jaw moved. Martin Shore arrived at 3 in the afternoon. He was 55, compact, wearing a suit that was slightly too warm for the season, and he had the eyes of someone who had heard a great many things he couldn't repeat and had organized his entire bearing around that habit of containment. He shook Elena's hand, looked around the suite with the professional attention of someone noting exits, and sat where Adriana indicated. He had the documents, or enough of them. The loan structure is complex, he said, laying a printed packet on the table. He spoke to both of them. He'd looked at Noah, taken a quick read of the situation, and included him without comment. Elena noted this. Reyes's lending arm used 3 intermediary entities to move capital into the Moretti-Voss portfolio over 9 years. The most recent tranche was 4 years ago, $18 million, which was used to fund the Carver building acquisition. Elena looked at the numbers. And the collateral? 40% equity stake in 7 properties, including the Carver building. He turned a page. The collateral clause in the lending agreement states that in the event of a change of controlling ownership in the collateralized assets, the lender has the right to call the note. Full repayment, 60 days. Victor knew this clause was there, Elena said. He signed the agreement. Shore's voice was neutral. So, yes. The sequence of it assembled itself fully in Elena's mind for the first time. Victor, 4 years ago, knowing that he and Elena were already fracturing, already separate in every way that mattered except legally, taking a loan with a change of ownership clause, collateralizing it against assets that were already in Elena's name, and then, when the divorce became inevitable, doing nothing to remove the collateral, letting the proceeding happen, letting her win, because winning meant owning the assets, and owning the assets meant inheriting the note. And the note was $63 million, and Dominic Reyes had 60 days to call it. What happens if the note is called and I can't pay? She said. She knew the answer, but she needed Shore to say it out loud. Reyes has the right to seize the collateralized properties, Shore said. 7 properties, including your largest holding, which would reduce your portfolio by approximately, he checked his papers, 68% of its current assessed value. She would lose the empire she'd just won, not back to Victor, to Reyes. Which was, she understood now, what Victor had designed. He couldn't keep it. The court had taken it. But if he couldn't have it, he could make sure she couldn't either. He could hand it to Reyes, the man he owed, the man he'd been managing for years, and walk away from the debt in the process. Victor Moretti. Even falling, engineering the fall to land on someone else. Is there a path where we contest the collateral agreement? Adriana said. Shore tilted his head. There are arguments. If the collateral was improperly disclosed, if Elena was never notified that her assets were being used as collateral, there's a fraudulent conveyance argument. But these documents, he tapped the packet, have her name nowhere in them. Technically, Victor collateralized assets that were in his wife's name without her signature. That's the argument. How strong is it? Strong enough to litigate, not strong enough to guarantee. He paused. And the time pressure is real, 60 days. If Reyes moves before we establish a litigation hold, he moves fast, Elena said. Reyes moves fast. Shore looked at her. You know him? I know his reputation. She held Shore's gaze. And I got a call yesterday from a woman named Petra Vance. Something shifted in Shore's expression, small, controlled, but she caught it. What did Petra Vance say? That some people would prefer a cooperative transition, that not everyone with an interest in Victor's business wants to see it collapse. She watched him. You know who she is? A pause. I know of her. Another pause. She's Reyes's attorney, his actual attorney, not his public face. If she called you directly, it means Reyes wants to talk. I don't want to talk to Dominic Reyes, Elena said. You may not have that option. Shore's voice wasn't harsh, just honest. If he calls the note and the litigation doesn't hold, you lose the portfolio. If you refuse to engage with him, you lose the portfolio. The only version where you don't lose the portfolio is one where you either pay him $63 million in 60 days, he said it without irony, or you negotiate. What does negotiate look like? Shore was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet. I don't know what he wants from this. It's possible he wants the properties. It's possible he wants something else, something you have now that Victor no longer does. The company, Noah said from across the table. Everyone looked at him. He doesn't just want the real estate, Noah said. He was looking at the document packet with his father's focused concentration and his own particular logic. The real estate is the collateral. He already knows he can take that. But the company, Moretti Voss Holdings, is worth more than the properties. The relationships, the contracts, the operational history. That's worth more. He looked up. Maybe he wants what Mom built, and Victor's situation gave him a way to get it without paying for it. Shore looked at the boy for a long moment. That's a reasonable read, he said. What? At 4:30, Elena's phone rang again. The same number as Petra Vance. She looked at it, looked at Adriana, looked at Shore. Shore nodded. She answered. Put it on speaker. Mrs. Voss Moretti. The same controlled voice. I trust you've had time to understand the situation more fully. I've had some time, Elena kept her voice even. I understand the loan structure. I understand the collateral. I understand the change of ownership clause. Good. A pause. Mr. Reyes would like to meet. To discuss what specifically? The future of Moretti Voss Holdings. The voice was smooth, unhurried. Mr. Reyes is not interested in litigation or property seizure. He's a businessman. He prefers ongoing relationships to one-time extractions. Another pause. He believes you are the right person to run the company going forward. He wants to install me as the operator of an enterprise that has been partially used to move his money. He wants a competent, legitimate-facing partner who has an established legal claim on the company's assets and a demonstrated willingness to fight for them. Vance's voice didn't change. What Victor gave him was exposure. What you give him is legitimacy. And if I decline? The note comes due in 60 days. He will not extend it. A beat. You would lose a great deal of what you fought very hard to win. Adriana was writing fast on her legal pad. Shore had his phone out, recording. I'll need time to consider, Elena said. Of course. Mr. Reyes suggested a meeting at the end of the week. Neutral location, your choice. The voice carried a thin trace of something that might have been appreciation. He respects what you did in that courtroom, Mrs. Voss Moretti. He has very few people he says that about. I'll be in touch, Elena said, and ended the call. The suite was quiet. She looked at her son, who was looking back at her with something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not fear, not anger, but something grimmer. The expression of someone who has just understood that the ground they're standing on has been rearranged and they must relearn the footing. You're not going to meet with him, Noah said. Not a question. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at Adriana, at Shore. Tell me I have another path, she said. Shore was quiet for a longer moment than she wanted. The fraudulent conveyance argument is real, but to make it stick in 60 days, to get a litigation hold that prevents Reyes from calling the note while we build the case, I'd need something in writing showing that Victor collateralized those assets without your knowledge or consent. He looked at her. Victor's signature on a statement, or an email, or something that establishes he kept this from you deliberately. Victor isn't going to give me anything that implicates him, Elena said. No. Shore agreed. He wouldn't. But someone might give it to us, Adriana said. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at her notes. Something had shifted in her expression, not certainty, but the close neighbor of it. Victor's former lawyers, the ones who structured the original loan agreement, 2 of them retired, 1 of them died. But there was a 4th attorney on that transaction, a junior partner at the time. She tapped her pen. A woman named Caroline Marsh. She left that firm 18 months ago after a falling out with the senior partners that became public enough to land in the trade press. She's currently in private practice. Adriana looked up. Attorneys have obligations to former clients, but those obligations have exceptions. Fraud is one of them. You think she'll talk? Elena said. I think she left that firm angry. I think she watched Victor's divorce proceeding with some interest. And I think, Adriana paused, I think she might have documents she's been waiting for a reason to use. The light in the suite had gone flat and orange with the late afternoon. Outside, the city was doing its 6 o'clock shift change, the daytime version becoming the evening version, traffic patterns altering, the particular noise frequency dropping and rising simultaneously. Elena thought about where she was. Hotel suite. 3 weeks out of the only home she'd known for 11 years. A court ruling in her name. An empire legally hers. A $63 million hole in the floor of it, dropped there by the man who'd built it with her 20 years ago, engineered as a final act of a war she thought she'd won. She thought about Petra Vance's voice. Mr. Reyes respects what you did. And the way respect from men like that was not a compliment. It was an assessment, evaluation, a statement of what they planned to take. She thought about Noah's face in the courtroom yesterday, his hand in hers. She thought about the version of herself she'd built in 4 years of preparation, methodical, patient, documented, careful. The version that had walked into that courtroom with everything arranged and nothing improvised and had won exactly what she'd planned to win. That version was not built for this. This was a different terrain. This required something she'd spent 4 years trying not to be. Set up the meeting with Caroline Marsh, she told Adriana. Tonight, if possible. She looked at Shore. I need to know how long it takes to build a fraudulent conveyance case that's strong enough for an emergency hold. 2 weeks minimum, probably 3. If I meet with Reyes, if I keep him in conversation, does that buy time? Shore considered it. It could. If he believes you're negotiating in good faith, but the moment he understands you're stalling, he moves, Elena said. Yes. She stood up. She moved to the window where Noah had stood earlier and looked at the city the way you look at something you've lived near so long you stopped seeing it. Then she turned back around. Noah, she said, I need you to tell me everything you remember from that meeting 3 months ago. Every word you can reconstruct. We're going to write it down and Shore is going to look at it and we're going to find out if there's anything in it that helps. Noah nodded. He pulled the chair out from the table, sat with his elbows on his knees, the posture of someone about to do something hard. And then? He asked. She looked at him. Then I'm going to call Petra Vance back, she said, and I'm going to set up a meeting with Dominic Reyes. And I'm going to walk into that meeting knowing exactly what he wants and exactly what I'm willing to give him, which is nothing, but he won't know that until it's too late. Noah was quiet. Then, that's what Dad does. That's his move. Walk into a room looking like you're going to deal and you've already decided you won't. She met her son's eyes. I know, she said. And in the particular silence that followed, Noah Voss Moretti looked at his mother and understood something that no child wants to understand about a parent. That the person who had spent 17 years protecting him from the world his father lived in had just crossed a line she had spent those same 17 years standing behind. And that the crossing was not a defeat, but it was a cost. And the cost was real, and she knew exactly what she was paying and had decided to pay it anyway, and that this was not the same thing as becoming victor. But it was closer than she'd ever been. The city outside the window went on without them, indifferent and enormous, and somewhere in it Dominic Reyes was waiting for a phone call, and somewhere in it Victor Moretti was sitting with whatever he felt about what he'd done, and somewhere in it Caroline Marsh was in a private office not knowing yet that the call that was coming would change the shape of her next several months, and the evening came on fast and cold, and Elena Voss stood at the window with her son behind her, and her lawyer and her criminal defense attorney watching and thought, I have never been in a room this dangerous. And then she thought, yes, I have. I built it. Caroline Marsh called back at 9:17 that night. Adriana had reached her through a mutual contact, a paralegal who'd worked at the old firm and still had Marsh's personal number. And whatever Adriana had said in the initial message, it had been enough. Marsh didn't ask for a meeting. She asked for a secure line in 48 hours. Adriana gave her the line. She gave her 24 hours. Elena didn't sleep. She sat at the desk with the financial documents Shore had left and went through them the way she used to go through development contracts in the early years, line by line, not trusting anyone else's summary, not stopping until she understood every clause in its own terms. The numbers were different now. The stakes were different. But the discipline was the same, and the discipline was what she had, so she used it. Noah fell asleep on the couch at midnight with his shoes still on and his phone on his chest. She covered him with the blanket from the bedroom and stood over him for a moment in the dark, doing the things she never let herself do when he was watching, just looking at him, the jaw, the eyelashes, the way he breathed with his mouth slightly open, young in sleep in a way he wasn't young anymore when awake. She went back to the desk. By 3 a.m, she had identified 2 additional properties with potential Reyes entanglement. Shell company tenants she'd cross-referenced against Meridian Capital's known subsidiary structure. By 5, she had a memo drafted for Shore that laid out the full scope of what she understood the collateral arrangement to cover and where the gaps in documentation were. By 6:30, she was in the shower letting the hot water work at the base of her skull where the tension had concentrated into something like a low-grade wound. She was dressed and at the table when Noah woke at 7, disoriented, reaching for his phone with the automatic reflex of his generation. "Did you sleep at all?" he said. "Some." She said it the same way he had 2 mornings ago. He recognized it and didn't push. Chet. Caroline Marsh called at 9:50 the following morning. She was 52, Elena would learn later, and she had a voice that sounded like someone who had made a significant decision recently and was living in the specific clarity that comes after a long internal argument finally resolves. She did not waste time. "I have the loan agreement," she said. "The original. Not the version that was submitted to the intermediaries. The actual governing document signed by Victor Moretti and the Meridian lending entity directly." A pause. "I also have a memorandum he signed 2 years before the loan, in which he explicitly acknowledges that the assets being used as collateral are registered in his wife's name and that she has not been informed of this arrangement." The room went very still. "He wrote that down," Elena said. "His attorney at the time, my senior partner, who has since retired to somewhere without an extradition treaty, required it as a liability protection measure. He wanted documentation that Victor understood the structure." Marsh's voice was dry. "Victor signed it without reading it carefully. He signed most things without reading them carefully if he trusted the person putting them in front of him." A pause. "He trusted my senior partner. He should not have." "Why are you doing this?" Elena said. A silence. Not evasive, but considering. "Because I spent 11 years in that firm building cases that protected men like Victor Moretti from consequences they'd earned," Marsh said. "And when I finally objected to something, a different case, a different client, a line I wasn't willing to cross, I was managed out in a way that was designed to make me look like the problem." Her voice was even, without theater. "I'm not doing this for you, Mrs. Voss Moretti. I'm doing it because the document exists, and it should be used, and this is the moment it becomes useful." "I understand," Elena said. "Can you transmit it to my attorney today?" "Already preparing it." A pause. "One more thing. The meeting with Reyes. If you're planning to go, and I suspect you are, you need to know that he already has a copy of the ownership transfer documents from your divorce proceeding. He has known about the change of ownership clause in the loan since before the ruling. He had someone in your proceedings who was feeding information." Elena thought of the 2 men in the gallery. Victor's side or his own? His own. Marsh said it flatly. Victor thought Reyes was his partner. He wasn't. He was managing Victor. This whole structure, the loan, the collateral, the timing, Reyes designed it. Victor executed it because he was told it was the best deal available. He probably didn't understand the full mechanism until recently. A pause. "You should know that going in. You're not walking into a meeting with Victor's creditor. You're walking into a meeting with the man who engineered Victor's entire financial dependency and has been waiting for the right moment to convert it." The call ended. Elena set the phone down on the table. Shore arrived 30 minutes later. By noon, he had reviewed the Marsh documents. By 12:40, he was on the phone with an emergency motion specialist at his firm. By 1:15, he had filed for a litigation hold on the collateralized properties, citing fraudulent conveyance, and had submitted the signed memorandum, Victor's own handwriting, Victor's own signature, confirming that he had knowingly used Elena's assets as collateral without her consent, as the primary evidentiary support. "How long for the hold to be granted?" Elena said. 48 hours. Maybe 72. Shore was moving fast, coat on, papers in hand. But the filing is public record the moment it hits the docket. Reyes will know within the hour. Which means the 60-day clock stops mattering, Elena said. Which means it becomes a race, Shore said. He knows we have the document. He knows the hold is coming. His options narrow fast. He looked at her. If he's going to move, he moves now, not in 60 days. Now. She called Petra Vance. "The meeting," she said when Vance answered. "Tonight, whatever location he wants." A pause. "That's sooner than expected." The timeline changed. Elena's voice was level. "He knows why." Another pause. Longer. 7 o'clock. The Aldrin Club on Precourt Street. Private dining room. A beat. "Come alone." "My attorney." "Comes alone means comes alone." Vance's voice didn't shift. "He knows you have counsel. He's not asking you to waive anything. He's asking you to have a conversation like two adults before this becomes something that damages everyone." Elena looked at Shore. He was already shaking his head. She held up a hand. 7 o'clock, she said, and ended the call. "Absolutely not," Shore said. "I need him talking instead of moving. Every hour he's in a conversation with me is an hour he's not accelerating the note." She met Shore's eyes. "You said 48 hours for the hold. I need 48 hours. You walk into a room alone with Dominic Reyes." "I've walked into rooms alone with men like Dominic Reyes for 20 years, she said. "I just didn't know their names." Well, she told Noah at 4. He stood in the kitchenette doorway with a glass of water and listened, and then set the glass down very carefully on the counter. "No," he said, "it's not a request for permission." "Mom." His voice cracked on the word, just at the edge. "You don't know what this man does to people who—" "I know exactly what he does." She kept her voice even, not hard, just certain. "That's why I'm going. Because if I don't, the hold might not hold and we lose everything. And if I do, I buy the time we need." She held his gaze. "Shore will be outside. Adriana will have the number for a contact at the DA's office who has been building a file on Reyes for 3 years, and who Adriana has now, as of this afternoon, shared Caroline Marsh's documents with." She waited for that to register. "If anything happens to me, the documents go public. Reyes knows that, which means nothing happens to me." Noah's jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle working in it. "You told the DA," he said. "Adriana did, 2 hours ago." She watched her son process it. "It changes the calculation for Reyes. He came into this thinking he could absorb the litigation and still move on the collateral. He can't absorb a federal disclosure. The Marsh documents show he was party to a fraudulent conveyance. That's RICO territory if the DA builds from it." She kept her eyes on Noah. "Tonight is about him understanding that the position he thought he was in has changed. That's all." Noah looked at her for a long moment, his father's eyes doing something that was entirely his own. "What if he doesn't care about the DA?" he said. "What if he's already past that point?" It was the right question. She'd been carrying it since noon. "Then Shore's outside," she said. "And I'm the best reader of rooms in this family. I've always been." He didn't like it. He would never like it. But he nodded. The Aldrin Club was the kind of place that had no sign outside. You knew it was there because someone had told you, and if no one had told you, that was information about what kind of person you were. Elena had been inside it twice, once with Victor, years ago, for a dinner with an investor she'd never entirely trusted, and who had later proven her right about that. The interior was dark wood and low light, and the particular hush of money that didn't need to announce itself. She arrived at 6:50. A man she didn't recognize met her at the door and walked her through the main room, half-occupied, discreet, no one looking at anyone else in the pointed way of people who were very much noting everything, and down a corridor to a private dining room at the back. Dominic Reyes was already there. He was not what she'd expected, which was its own kind of useful data. She'd constructed an image from his reputation. Imposing, theatrical, the kind of physical presence that announced itself. Instead, he was 60. Average height, with a forgettable face, and pale eyes behind plain glasses, and the kind of stillness that doesn't come from composure, but from total absence of performance. He wore a gray suit. He was drinking water. He stood when she entered, not a courtesy she'd anticipated. Mrs. Voss Moretti. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Thank you for coming." She sat. She did not thank him for the invitation. He sat. A waiter appeared, was dismissed with a small motion of Reyes's hand, disappeared. "You filed the hold this afternoon," he said. "Yes." "And you've shared documents with the DA's office." "Yes." He looked at her the way Shore had looked at Noah, the particular attention of someone recalibrating an assessment. "You move fast." "I had good reason to." She kept her hands on the table, visible, relaxed. Her heart was doing something loud behind her sternum, but her hands were not going to show it. "You engineered this, the loan structure, the collateral, the change of ownership clause. You designed it so that Victor's losses would become my exposure." He didn't confirm or deny it. He looked at her with the pale eyes and waited. "What I want to know," she said, "is why. Not Victor. Victor was the mechanism. Why did you want the company?" A pause. Something moved in his expression, appreciation maybe, for the directness. Moretti Voss Holdings has a development track record and a set of municipal relationships that took 20 years to build, he said. That's hard to replicate. Victor had access to it, but Victor was, increasingly, a liability. His methods were drawing attention that complicated certain operations. He picked up his water glass, set it down. "I needed a different steward, someone with clean hands and a legal claim and the competence to run it without creating problems." He met her eyes. "You fit those requirements better than Victor ever did." "You wanted to remove him," she said. "I wanted to transition away from him." The distinction was precise. "The divorce gave me the mechanism. If you won the assets, the collateral transferred with them. If you couldn't pay the note, I took the collateral, the properties. And you took the rest of the company at a significantly reduced value, which would make you financially pressured, legally complicated, and potentially interested in a partnership that provided stability." He paused. "If you could pay, or could credibly threaten to fight the note, then we were going to have this conversation anyway, just from different positions. Either way, you got what you wanted. Either way, we're having a conversation." He looked at her steadily. "Victor built you into this, whether you liked it or not. I'm not apologizing for that. I'm telling you the truth of the position." She sat with it for a moment. The waiter had come back without her noticing, and there was water in front of her now. She didn't touch it. "What does the partnership look like?" she said. Not agreement. Information gathering. She needed to know the shape of what she was refusing. "You operate Moretti Voss Holdings. Clean, legitimate, expanding. My capital continues to flow through the approved commercial structures, the ones that are documented, disclosed, legally defensible." He said it carefully. "Nothing that creates exposure for you. Nothing that replicates Victor's arrangements. And in exchange, the note is discharged, the collateral released, and you receive a capital infusion of $40 million over 3 years to develop the portfolio." He paused. "I get a return on investment, a stabilized structure, and the ongoing arrangement. You get the company you built, free and clear, with resources Victor never gave you." It was, she recognized, a genuinely good offer. That was the most frightening thing about it. It would solve every immediate problem. The hold, the litigation, the 60-day pressure, the financial exposure, all of it cleared. In exchange for being the legitimate face on an arrangement that was cleaner than Victor's but was still an arrangement, still Reyes, still a room she would never fully be able to leave once she entered it. "I need time to consider," she said. "You have until midnight," he said. "Not cruel, just final. The litigation hold complicates my timeline. I need to know tonight whether we are building something or dismantling it." She stood. He stood. They looked at each other across the table in the low light of the Aldrin Club's private dining room, and Elena thought about every room she had ever stood in where the person across from her had more power, and she had won anyway, and thought about whether this was that room, and thought about what winning actually meant in it. "I'll call Petra Vance before midnight," she said. He nodded once. Respect again. The same assessment as before, both the valuation, the calculation of what she was worth to him. She felt it land and let it slide off and walked back through the low-lit dining room and down the corridor and through the main room and out the door into the cold October night, where Shore was waiting in a car 20 feet from the entrance, and she got in, and the door closed, and he looked at her. "Well?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for a long moment. "It's a clean offer." "I know." "It solves the immediate problem." "I know." "But it puts you in a room with Reyes for the foreseeable." "I know," she said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. She breathed. "I know. Drive." He drove. The city slid past the windows. She looked at her phone. 8:17. 3 hours and 43 minutes until midnight. She called Adriana. "Tell me where the DA is," she said. "Specifically, what does he have and what does he need?" Adriana's voice was careful. "He has our documents. He has some of his own. He's been building the Reyes file for 2 years," he said. "He needs something connective, something that directly links Reyes to the fraudulent conveyance rather than just establishing that Victor did it." "The memorandum establishes Victor knew," Elena said. "Does it implicate Reyes directly?" "It references the lending party's awareness of the ownership structure," Adriana said, "which is close. But Reyes's attorneys would argue the memorandum only documents Victor's acknowledgement, not Reyes's active participation in the fraud." She watched the city go by. She thought about what Reyes had just told her. The precision of it, the way he'd laid out the structure as if describing a business plan, without guilt, without defensiveness, with the calm of someone who had done this kind of thing many times in many rooms, and had learned that honest clarity was more effective than pretense. She thought about a specific thing he had said. Victor's losses would become my exposure. He had described the mechanism. He had described his own design of it. To her face. In a private dining room with no witnesses. She thought about the small recording device that Adriana had slipped into the inner pocket of her jacket 3 hours ago, just before she'd left the hotel. The one that was the size of a button and had 6 hours of battery, and had been recording from the moment she walked through the Aldrin Club's door. She thought about how Reyes had said, "I designed it so that Victor's losses would become your exposure." And, "My capital continues to flow through the approved commercial structures." And, "Victor was increasingly a liability." She thought about what a federal prosecutor could do with a recording of Dominic Reyes explaining his own fraudulent conveyance scheme in a private dining room because he was so certain of his position that the explaining had felt safe. She thought about 48 hours. The time Shore had said for the litigation hold. She thought about midnight, the time Reyes had given her. She looked at Shore. "Turn around," she said. He glanced at her in the rear view. "Where are we going?" "Back toward Precourt Street. There's a parking garage on Medwick, 1 block west of the Aldrin Club. Pull in and stop." She was already dialing Adriana. "I need you to call your DA contact right now, tonight. Tell him I have a recording." She pressed the phone to her ear. "Tell him I need to know if it's enough." Shore didn't ask questions. He was already turning. Adriana picked up on the second ring. "Listen to me," Elena said. "I need the next 30 minutes to count for something." The car moved through the city. The streets were wet. It had rained while she was inside, that fast, cold rain that October produces without warning. And the lights reflected off the pavement in long, broken columns, and everything looked like it was doubled, like there were 2 cities, and Elena Voss was moving through both of them simultaneously, the one where she was a woman who had won a courtroom battle and inherited a trap, and the one where she was something she hadn't been before. Someone willing to use the trap as a weapon. She had 3 hours and 22 minutes. She had a recording of a man who had spent decades being too careful to be caught, who had spent 30 minutes explaining himself to a woman he had decided was already his because he had designed the situation to leave her no other choice, and who had not considered, not for a single moment, that the woman he was explaining himself to had learned everything she knew about power from 20 years beside a man exactly like him, and had spent the last 4 years learning what those 20 years had cost her, and had decided somewhere between the courthouse steps and the Aldrin Club's private dining room that the patience she had built and the documentation she had gathered and the discipline she had maintained were not going to be handed to another man's structure, regardless of how clean the offer was, regardless of how much it solved, regardless of how good it felt to have someone finally acknowledge what she was worth. She was worth more than being useful to Dominic Reyes. She was going to prove it in the next 3 hours and 22 minutes, or she was going to lose everything, and the losing would be real, and the consequences would be lasting, and she understood that completely, and was moving anyway, because the alternative was a room she would never leave, and she had spent enough of her life in rooms she could not leave, and she was done. Shore pulled into the parking garage on Medwick, cut the engine. She was still on the phone with Adriana. Adriana was already talking to someone else on another line, the particular multitasking Elena had come to read as her attorney operating at full capacity. Then Adriana came back. "He wants to hear it," Adriana said. Her voice had an edge Elena hadn't heard before, something that was as close to excitement as Adriana Vale allowed herself. "The DA! He wants to hear the recording tonight." Elena exhaled. "Tell him we're coming to him," she said. She reached into her jacket pocket and felt the small, hard shape of the recording device, the size of a button, warm from her body, carrying inside it 30 minutes of Dominic Reyes describing his own design in a room he had believed was safe. She looked at Shore. "Drive," she said. And Shore drove, and the city went past them fast and wet and full of light, and somewhere on Precourt Street, Dominic Reyes was waiting for a phone call that was not going to come the way he expected, and somewhere in a hotel room, Noah Voss Moretti was waiting for his mother to come back, and somewhere in the city, Victor Moretti was living with whatever he felt about everything he'd set in motion, and Elena held the recording device in her closed fist and felt her pulse in her palm and thought, "This is it." The DA's name was Gerald Fitch. He was 58, tall, with the particular leanness of someone who had spent decades doing work that burned through everything unnecessary. And he met them in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building on Sutter Street that had the institutional quiet of a place where serious things were decided without theater. He had 2 people with him, a woman who was introduced as his deputy and a younger man who handled the recording equipment. And he shook Elena's hand with the directness of someone who had assessed her before she arrived and had decided to proceed on the basis of that assessment. He listened to the recording twice. The first time he was still, eyes on the table, hands flat. The second time he paused it twice, asked his deputy to make note of specific timestamps, and then sat back in his chair and looked at Elena in a way that held a long history of calculation. "He described the mechanism himself," Fitch said. "Yes. And he had no reason to believe he was being recorded. None that he indicated." Fitch was quiet for a moment. His deputy was already on a laptop, and the younger man was transferring the recording to a secured drive with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that what he was handling was perishable in the wrong conditions. "I've been building toward Reyes for 26 months, Fitch said. He said it without complaint, just as fact. "What I've had is structural, pattern evidence, associate testimony that's credible but attackable. What I don't have, what I've needed, is something direct." He looked at the recording device, which was sitting on the table between them in a small evidence bag Shore had produced from somewhere. "This is direct." "Is it enough?" Elena said. "It's enough to move." He met her eyes. "Not enough to guarantee a conviction. That's a longer conversation for a different night. But it's enough to move in a way that materially changes his position before midnight." She understood what he was offering. Not a promise. A weapon. "What do you need from me?" she said. "A formal statement. Tonight. And your agreement to cooperate with the ongoing investigation as a witness, not a subject." He looked at Shore. "She's a witness." "She's a witness," Shore said. He said it firmly, and Fitch nodded, and that was the shape of the agreement they built in the next 20 minutes in the fluorescent-lit conference room on Sutter Street while the city finished its Wednesday and went to sleep without knowing any of this was happening inside it. She called Petra Vance at 11:40, 20 minutes before Reyes's midnight deadline, and she sat in Shore's car outside the building on Sutter Street with her statement signed and her hands finally still. Not the controlled stillness of the last 4 days, but something different. The stillness after. Vance answered on the first ring. "I've made a decision," Elena said. "I'm listening. I'm declining the offer." She kept her voice even. "And I think you should know that in the next several hours, Mr. Reyes is going to receive information that significantly alters his current position. I'd suggest he use the time before then to consult his own attorneys about what cooperation with an ongoing federal investigation might look like." A long silence. "Mrs. Voss Moretti." Vance's voice had changed, not broken, but shifted, the way a room shifts when someone opens a window. "What have you done?" "What I had to." She paused. "Tell him I said thank you for the honest conversation. He was the first person in this entire situation who told me the complete truth. I wanted to return the courtesy." She ended the call. Shore was watching her from the driver's seat. She could feel his attention without looking at it. "Done?" he said. "Drive me back to my son," she said. It was 12:20 when she got back to the hotel. Noah was awake. She had known he would be. He was sitting on the couch in the same clothes he'd been wearing all day. And when she came through the door, he looked at her face with the specific attention of someone who has been waiting and has spent the wait imagining outcomes, and she watched him read what was in her face and watched him exhale. "Okay," he said. Just that. She sat down next to him on the couch. She was tired in a way that went past the body into something structural, something in the load-bearing parts of her that had been underweight for so long, she'd stopped noticing the effort of holding it and would only notice it now, in the days ahead, as it began to lift. "It's done," she said, "or the beginning of done. It'll take time." "Reyes?" "The DA has the recording. He's moving on it tonight." She looked at her son. "The litigation hold stands. Marcia's documents are in the federal file. The collateral arrangement is going to be challenged as fraudulent conveyance, and this time we have Reyes's own voice describing how he designed it." Noah processed this. She could see it happening, the tracking, the assembling. "He's going to know it was you," he said. "He already does." She looked at her hands in her lap. "He's a careful man. He'll calculate his options. He won't—" She paused, chose the word precisely. "He won't act against me directly. It's not in his interest. Anything that happens to me now makes the federal case stronger and makes him the primary suspect. He knows that. He'll just absorb it," Noah said. There was something tired in his voice that she recognized from her own voice. The exhaustion of understanding that some men have the resources to survive their own crimes at great cost, while the people around them absorb smaller costs without that cushion. "He'll fight it," she said. "His lawyers are very good. It might take years, but he is not going to be focused on Moretti Voss Holdings. He is going to be focused on his own survival." She looked at Noah. "Which means we have space." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And Dad," she breathed. "Dad is... Your father is going to face questions from the DA about the collateral arrangement, about his knowing role in the fraud. He didn't design it, but he participated in it. What happens with that is..." She stopped. "That's not mine to determine." Noah looked at the middle distance for a long moment. His jaw was working on something. Then, "Is he going to prison?" She held the question. The honest answer was she didn't know. The truthful answer was that she hadn't asked Fitch specifically about Victor's exposure, and that the omission had been deliberate because some part of her still did not want to be the person who was responsible for that outcome, even after everything. "I don't know," she said. Noah nodded slowly. "Okay." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Okay." "How are you?" she said. She asked it directly, the way she'd learned to ask him things in the last 4 years. Not circling, not softening the ask into something he could deflect. He thought about it for a real moment, not performing consideration, actually taking inventory. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think I will be, eventually." He looked at her. "You?" She thought about the hotel suite that didn't smell like hers, the documents on the desk, the 4 days that had compressed a decade of accumulated reckoning into a sequence of rooms and phones, and a recording device the size of a button in a conference room on Sutter Street. The same, she said. Eventually. He leaned his head back against the couch. She did the same. They sat like that for a little while, not talking, in the particular quiet of people who have been through something together and don't need to describe it to each other. Yin. 3 weeks later, Gerald Fitch's office filed a federal complaint naming Dominic Reyes and 2 Meridian Capital associates in connection with wire fraud and conspiracy to commit fraudulent conveyance. The complaint ran to 47 pages and cited, among other evidence, a recorded conversation in which the primary subject described the mechanism of the fraud in specific operational detail. The litigation hold on Moretti Voss Holdings properties was confirmed by the court, and the collateral arrangement was suspended pending the outcome of the federal proceeding. Shore called Elena with the news at 8:15 in the morning, and she was already at the desk. The desk in the actual office she'd moved into 3 days after returning to work, the one on the 14th floor of the Carver building that had been Elena's in name for 9 years and in practice never, the one with the east-facing window that caught the morning light. Confirmed, Shore said. The hold stands. The properties are yours, unencumbered, pending resolution. How long does resolution take? Federal case? 3 years? Maybe 4. During which time the company operates normally. During which time the company operates normally, he confirmed. She thanked him. She put the phone down. She looked at the east-facing window for a moment, at the light coming through it, and then she picked up the file she'd been working through before the call and went back to it. The first time she saw Victor after the courthouse was 5 weeks later. It was not planned. She had been leaving a property inspection at the South Waterfront development, the first one, the converted warehouse, the one Douglas Trent had testified about in the divorce proceeding, and she was walking back to her car, and he was coming out of a building across the street. He looked different. She noticed it from distance before he noticed her, which gave her a few seconds to prepare something inside herself, to make space for whatever the moment required. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize, and he looked like a man who had recently lost weight in a way that wasn't intentional, and he was alone, which was in itself a statement about the state of things. He saw her. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other across a wet street in November with a cold wind coming off the waterfront and the kind of gray sky that commits to its grayness without apology. He crossed the street. She waited. He stopped a few feet from her, not aggressive, not approaching, just present. Elena, he said. Victor. He looked at her face with the same directness as in the courtroom, but different. Stripped of the courtroom's architecture, stripped of lawyers and documents and a judge, he was just a man standing on a street. She had known this man when he was 26 years old and didn't own anything and had believed genuinely that what they were building together was the real thing. She could still access that memory. Not with warmth exactly, but without the revision that grief sometimes applies, the retroactive decision that everything was false because the ending was. Some of it had been real. She'd made peace with that being complicated. The DA's office called me, he said, about the Reyes situation. I assumed they would. They want to know what I knew and when. His voice was carefully neutral. She could hear the effort in it. My lawyers are telling me to cooperate. That sounds like good legal advice, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face, not regret exactly, more like the specific expression of a man who is looking at the gap between what he planned and what happened and is still processing its dimensions. The collateral arrangement, he said. He stopped, started again. I didn't expect it to go the way it went. Reyes represented it as Victor. She said it quietly, not hard, not forgiving, just final. I don't need to hear what Reyes represented, what you did, and why you did it. That's for the DA and for your lawyers and for you to work through. It's not something I can help you with. She held his gaze. It's not something I'm going to help you with. He held her gaze. A muscle in his jaw moved. Noah won't return my calls, he said. She breathed. This was the harder part. This was the part she had no clean answer to. Noah is 17, she said. He'll make his own choices about that. I'm not going to tell him how to feel about you. But you're not going to encourage it. I'm going to stay out of it. She looked at him steadily. He knows where you are. If he wants to call, he'll call. That's between you. Victor looked at the street, at the waterfront beyond, at something she couldn't see, then back at her. You built something, he said. The company. Even then, when we were still, you were building something real. I knew it. He paused. I treated it like it was mine because I didn't know how to value something I didn't think I could lose. She listened to this. She let it be what it was. Not an apology, not exactly, but the closest thing to honest she'd heard from him in years. Maybe the closest thing he was capable of, which was not the same as what she needed, but was still, she recognized, something. I know, she said. I know you knew. She paused. That's what made it so hard. They stood in the cold for another moment, then she nodded once. Not warmth, not warmth's absence, just acknowledgement. And she walked to her car and she didn't look back, and she didn't need to. Noah called Victor in December. He told Elena about it afterward, sitting at her kitchen table, the kitchen of the apartment she'd moved into in November, hers, small and on the west side of the city with windows that faced a courtyard, with a mug of coffee going cold in front of him. I didn't really know what to say, he told her, so I mostly just listened. What did he say? Noah turned the mug. He said he was sorry, in the way Dad says things, not like he was asking for anything, just putting it down somewhere. He paused. He asked about school. I told him about the architecture program I'm looking at. Another pause. He said he thought you'd be glad. Elena was at the counter, her back partly toward him, and she let a moment pass before she said anything. He's not wrong, she said. Noah looked at her. Will you see him at some point? She thought about it honestly rather than answering from the position she'd had prepared for the last 3 months. At some point, she said. When it makes sense. When it's about you, maybe. Not yet. Noah nodded. He picked up the mug, found it cold, set it back down. Mom. He said it in the way that meant something was coming he'd been carrying for a while. When you went into that meeting with Reyes, that night, he looked at her. Were you scared? Yes. But you went anyway. Yes. He was quiet. I keep thinking about that, about what it takes to know that something is the right move and also know it might go badly and go anyway. He looked at his hands. Dad never seemed scared of anything. I used to think that was strength. Now I think it just meant he didn't understand what he was risking. He looked up at her. You understood and went anyway. That's different. She looked at her son, this boy with his father's eyes, and her father's jaw, and his own particular and specific and irreducible self. And she thought about what it cost to raise someone honest in an environment that rewarded something else, and whether she had managed it, and whether the fact that he could see the distinction between courage and recklessness meant that something had come through intact despite everything. She thought it had. It's not always that clear in the moment, she said. What's right? You do your best with what you know, and you try not to let fear make the decision for you. She held his gaze. That's all it ever is. He nodded slowly. Something settled in his face. Not resolution. He was 17. Resolution was a long way off on most of the things he was carrying. But something. Machen. The Moretti Voss Holdings Board met for the first time under Elena's formal authority in January. She had spent November and December restructuring the executive team, letting go of 3 people whose utility to the company had been primarily their relationship with Victor, bringing in 2 people she'd worked with in the early years who had built their own careers since and who she trusted in the specific way you trust people you've seen work under pressure. The meeting was held in the conference room on the 14th floor of the Carver building. It was cold outside, the deep cold of January that makes the city contract into itself. And the room was warm, and the light was good, and the table was full. She had prepared the way she always prepared completely. She knew every number, every contract, every open question in the portfolio. She had a plan for the next 18 months that was aggressive in some places and conservative in the places where aggression would create exposure. She had already had conversations with 2 municipal partners that suggested the company's relationships with the city had survived the last several months largely intact, which was partly because of the company's track record and partly because Elena had spent November personally calling every significant city contact and being very direct about who was running what and why. She opened the meeting. She went through the agenda without theater. The people around this table were capable, and they asked good questions, and she answered them. And partway through the second hour, she had the particular sensation, quiet, not triumphant, something more useful than triumph, of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she had always been capable of doing, in a room that now had her name on it, because a judge in a courtroom had confirmed what had always been true. When the meeting ended and the room emptied, she sat alone at the table for a few minutes. She wasn't doing anything, not reviewing notes, not checking her phone, just sitting in the room with the late January light coming through the east windows, thin and clean and entirely without apology. She had been married for 23 years. She had spent 20 of them making something real, and 3 of them watching it become something else, and 4 years after that building the case for what it had always been. She had walked into a courtroom and won, and then discovered that winning was the beginning of something harder, and she had walked through that too. She had made choices she was not comfortable with, and had made them anyway, and lived inside the discomfort and come through it, and was going to keep coming through it, because the alternative was giving the last 27 years to something that deserved them, and that was finished. She was not unscathed. She knew that. The price of the last 4 years was not going to be fully tabulated for a while yet. There were things in her she didn't have words for, absences where things had been that she hadn't finished naming. She would sit with Noah in the kitchen on weekend mornings and feel the specific shape of what the years had asked of him and know that some of that was hers to carry. She would think about Victor, occasionally, with the complicated non-feeling of someone who has loved a thing and watched it become unrecognizable and found they are no longer sure which parts were real and which were projected, and she would sit with that too. But the work was here. The building was here. Noah was here. Enrolled in a pre-architecture program at the city college, studying late in his room, texting her pictures of elevation drawings at 11 at night with captions that were mostly complaint and partly pride. He was here, and he was whole, as much as 17 allows for whole, and she had managed that. Through everything, that had held. She picked up the portfolio file from the table and slid it into her bag. She stood. She looked at the room one more time. The good light, the warm air, the table she was going to sit at again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Then she turned off the light and walked out. The DA's case against Dominic Reyes went to a federal grand jury in March. Reyes's attorneys were, as expected, very good. The case would take years. The outcome was not certain. Elena followed it the way you follow something that matters but is no longer in your hands, checking in, staying informed, but not letting it be the room she was living in. Petra Vance called her once, in February, to say that her representation of Reyes had concluded and that she was returning to private corporate practice. She did not explain further. Elena said she understood, and they ended the call with the particular courtesy of 2 people who had been on opposite sides of something difficult and had each conducted themselves within their own terms. Victor cooperated with the DA's investigation. The terms of his cooperation were not disclosed publicly, and Shore, who had contacts who would know, told Elena only that it appeared comprehensive. What it would mean for Victor's own exposure was a question that would also take time to answer. Elena did not call him. She did not avoid him. She existed in the city as herself, and so did he, and whatever they were now was not a word she needed to find. Noah saw him twice in the first half of the year. He reported back both times with the careful precision of a boy who is managing his own feelings about something and has decided that reporting the facts is safer than reporting the feelings. And Elena received both reports the same way, listening, not interpreting, trusting him to find his own way through it in the time he needed. Isabella Romano, she heard through no particular source she could name. The way you hear things in a city when your name has been in the news had left. Some said she'd gone back to where she'd come from. Some said elsewhere. Elena didn't spend time on it. Isabella had been a young woman in a complicated position, and whatever her choices had been, they belonged to her. One evening in April, Elena drove out to the south waterfront without particular intention. It was a Thursday, early evening, the light going golden and low over the water in the way that April light does when it's finally meaning it. She parked and walked along the waterfront road past the first development, the converted warehouse, Douglas Trent's project. 2 decades of her work made permanent in brick and glass, and the particular design language she'd built when she was 29, and building something she believed in. She stood and looked at it for a while. She thought about 29, the money from her mother's estate, the account she'd emptied because Victor had a vision and she'd had the means and the competence to make it real, and she'd believed completely that what they were building was theirs together. She thought about the woman she'd been, capable and clear-eyed in some ways, and in other ways willing to accept conditions she should have examined, willing to make herself smaller in ways she hadn't identified as making herself smaller, because the making smaller happened slowly and looked, from inside, like compromise. She didn't hate that woman. She had no energy for that, and it wouldn't be just. That woman had built real things. That woman had raised a son who could tell the difference between courage and recklessness. That woman had spent 4 years building a case with the discipline of someone who understood that the truth needed to be documented before it would be believed. That woman was standing at the waterfront in April light, looking at something she'd built 20 years ago that was still standing. The wind off the water was cold. She put her hands in her coat pockets. She stood there until the light changed and the gold went out of it and the water turned gray in the early evening. Then she walked back to her car. She had a meeting at 8 in the morning. She had a property inspection at 11. She had Noah coming for dinner on Saturday, and she had promised him she would actually cook something rather than ordering in, and she had a bottle of wine she'd been saving for no particular reason, and had decided Saturday was particular enough. She started the car. She drove home through the city in the early evening, through the neighborhoods she knew and the ones she didn't, past the buildings she owned and the ones she didn't, through the ordinary machinery of a city that was still going, still making itself up as it went, indifferent and enormous and full of everything. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off and the window down an inch despite the cold, because she'd always thought better with moving air. And she was thinking about tomorrow and the day after and all the ordinary, difficult, irreplaceable days stacked ahead of her. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely identify, the thinking felt like possibility rather than calculation. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. She kept driving.